What's up, guys? I'm coming at you from Chongqing with a good friend of mine, Ben Norton, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the exodus of TikTokers to XiaoHongShu, the Chinese app. It's quite a big story, and I'm sure you've been following it.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, what do you think about what's going on? How do you see it?
I mean, there's a deep irony in this that we have to start by talking about, which is that, the US government has spread this propaganda about China for a long time.
Yep.
And now here we see that it's actually the US that is the one that's trying to censor social media and ban an entire social media platform, TikTok, which is one of the most popular media platforms in the US.
Yep.
So that part is, of course, deeply ironic. But there's also the fact that I think is really interesting is that you see a lot of people who are not really interested in politics, who don't know anything about China, who are moving over to this platform, XiaoHongShu, which ironically means little red book.
Right.
And you see them, they're going over to this Chinese platform and talking to people from mainland China they've never met. They've never been here. They've never had the experience of understanding what's going on in this massive country with 1.4 billion people. This is their first time, and you see so many posts that have gone viral of people saying, I didn't realize, for instance, there's no social credit score system. It's completely false. Or that, for instance, that the cost of everything is so affordable in China. Like food costs are like 1/7 the price in the US. So all these people are for the first time being exposed to information that the US government has tried to, medical costs that the US government has tried to hide from them for so many years. So it's the perfect explosion of this propaganda bubble. It's hilarious.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, they didn't come specifically to learn about China. It's more of a consequence based on what unfolded, which we'll get to a little bit later. Now, all of a sudden, people are interested in learning about China, and they're getting the information directly from Chinese people, because before, the information they got about China had to compete with a lot of BS online.
Yeah.
And so they get a far more, ironically, pure view of what's actually going on here by communicating with people directly. So on the topic of this renewed interest or brand new interest in learning about China, what it's like in China, I think maybe we should talk a little bit about that, because, I mean, you've been in China for a year and a half. I've been in China for 16 years. And maybe we can tell people, now that they're interested about it, what is it like here in China?
Yeah, well, it's been an amazing experience. First of all, I'll say that we're speaking to people from Chongqing, which is a massive city. When you include the metropolitan area, we're talking about well over 30 million people. But what's amazing about this place is that a lot of people outside of Asia have never even heard of Chongqing. And yeah, this is bigger than most cities on earth, right? Like, China is such a massive country. There's so many, there are over 50 recognized ethnic groups, and there are 1.4 billion people and tons of cultures, and it's like a continent. And yet there's so little good information outside, especially in the West, because of all of this propaganda, and because most of the people reporting on China in the West are just political actors. They're anti-China activists, right? So being able to spend time here has been really rewarding, and being able to see, I feel really privileged being able to see what, again, 1/5 of humanity has this very unique civilization and a very unique model, a very unique system. And it's been very impressive to see what's been accomplished. I mean, first of all, just how in the span of a very short period of time, of over 40 years, more than 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. And China alone is responsible for 3/4 of global extreme poverty reduction. And you can see that. I mean, you've been here 16 years, so you can see just in a decade the massive changes. The level of development, the level of infrastructure. So right now we're in a very working class part of Chongqing. We're not in the center of the touristy area.
Yeah, there's some university here, and it's kind of an art district. Yeah.
Yeah, but what's amazing is there's the subway line. You can ride on the subway, which is usually it's 4 yuan, which is half a US dollar, to go across the city. I mean, it's so modern, it's so developed. Ironically, here's a Tesla car right here. Yeah. I mean, and it's amazing also the level of security, of safety. So I live in Beijing, right, and Chongqing similar. At any hour at night, you can walk around. People are not afraid.
My kids go out by themselves too. I mean,
And even that is something that's new, because I know when you got here originally and a few decades ago, there was a lot of delinquency and violent crime, and they've completely cleaned it up. It's very safe. Women, I've heard from many friends, they say like women can walk around at night and they're not ever afraid. Whereas like even in the US, I mean, not only are you afraid of like getting, like robbed or something, but getting shot. I mean, in the US on average, there are 2 or even 3 are like mass shootings every single day on average in the US. So it's just like, it's really rewarding to be able to see what 1.4 billion people are living like and to get an experience, because in the US people have no idea. I mean, it's really shocking when you actually get to see what it's like and how different it is. It really is eye-opening.
It's incredible. I do have an American friend here too who said he has to actively try to remind himself not to become too relaxed, because he knows that eventually he'll go back to the West and he'll get lazy with the sense of security that he has here. He has to remember and continually remind himself, okay, I got to remember when I get back that I can't do this anymore, that I have
or
to
like
be
recording
conscious.
this right now.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of places in the US where I would not be recording with
Just grab it or whatever.
Yeah, and many other countries. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Latin America. I would never do that in many places.
Yeah.
Someone would just come.
Whereas here you have people who literally just leave their bag on whatever, a table somewhere at a Starbucks or something like that, to reserve it and then come back, 15 minutes later, and they know it's going to be okay. No, it is incredible. No, and there's kind of an irony about what has happened and how it's unfolded, because as you said, so everybody's flocking over to this app, and it is due to TikTok on the cusp of being banned, and that kind of validated China's approach. They call it digital sovereignty, don't they?
Yeah.
Because what they're essentially saying is they are worried that, for example, the Chinese government will eventually
This is what the US government is claiming.
Yeah, this is what they're claiming. There's no evidence that it actually is happening or could happen, but they're saying that just based on the risk that they're selling, this idea of, that the Chinese government might control TikTok and influence people in the exact same way that they do control their social media
That the US government
platforms
does actually.
and influence foreign
Yeah.
populations. Even that is grounds for being banned. So all of a sudden, they've validated the other countries who say, no, because we know for a fact this is what you're doing with your social media platforms and influencing our people, interfering with our elections. Well, in fact, they're even interfering with their own elections, as we saw with the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story in 2020. They've basically validated what the approaches of these other countries to say, no, we need digital sovereignty. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so first of all, the reason that the US government is trying to ban TikTok, there are 2 main reasons. Now, one of them is that the US simply doesn't want any competitors to big tech corporations. So we know that Facebook, the parent company Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, the billionaire, they have been lobbying very aggressively to censor TikTok and to ban TikTok. And now they're getting what they wanted, right? So that's one of the main reasons. And this is, the US has been waging economic war against China, and especially Chinese technology companies, against Huawei, Xiaomi, other competitors. Now the US has 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So you have all these like BYDs going around, we can see driving around. Yeah. These great cars that people in the US are never going to be able to drive because they're not going to be imported, because they'll have 100% tariffs. So that's one of the reasons. Yeah. And then the other reason, which we now know, is political. Well, they're both political, which is that people on TikTok there is not as much political censorship of, for instance, pro-Palestinian material. And it's not just Palestine, it's other issues that the US government doesn't want people to know about. They don't want to know about the fact that the US is sponsoring these crimes that Israel is committing, and in other countries. And the algorithm in TikTok is very different. Despite the fact that TikTok is itself not even Chinese. Its parent company, ByteDance, is Chinese. TikTok is actually based in Singapore. And we saw, this hilarious grilling in the US Congress where Tom Cotton, this neoconservative Republican, he didn't even know that Singapore basically is different. I mean, like he assumed that Singapore was part of China. This is how ignorant this guy is. Right. So there's that part of it. Right, that's the overall political context. But then, so now this idea of digital sovereignty is becoming more and more popular because China has been saying for decades that the US government uses these social media platforms as a form of meddling in other countries. Right. We've seen this happen again and again. People can go up and look up an article in the Guardian newspaper, which admitted that the CIA was using social media in Cuba to try to destabilize the Cuban government. And they even created a fake Twitter, which was called Zunzuneo. So the CIA did that. We know this. We also know that the US government has used social media platforms to spread propaganda in Iran, in Russia, in Venezuela, in many other countries they're targeting for destabilization. This has been admitted. So China said, okay, we're going to create our own digital sovereign platforms that the US government can't control. And it's not, people focus on the censorship element. I mean, there is censorship, but it's very clear. It's very clearly delineated. People know what it's
Yeah,
like.
you have some personal examples of how the censorship works. If one of your videos was in violation of the rules, right?
And it's very I mean, in many cases.
So if you give an example of what happens to your video, what it says, and how you fix it.
Yeah. So for instance, I translate some of my English language YouTube channel, YouTube videos, and put them over into my Bilibili channel in Chinese.
Yeah.
And some of my videos about Syria had flags of this Al-Qaeda rebranded group, which was previously Jabhat al-Nusra and is now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a registered terror organization, and they had the flags. And because Bilibili, they wouldn't allow you to have those flags because this is a registered terror organization. So, I mean, that it's obviously makes sense.
So when your video gets flagged or gets blocked, what does it tell you, and how do you handle it?
It says, unlike on YouTube, when they censor you, or other platforms where like Facebook will ban your account, they don't even give you a reason. They give you like some arbitrary, you violated the community standards. They don't say what it was. They don't give you a specific answer. They don't have to give you a specific answer. On the Chinese platforms, they say very clearly, they say, if you want to publish this video, they say from like 4:39 to 4:57, from this time frame, you have this material, and this is the policy you're violating. And what you do is you cut it out, you replace it with something else, and then you upload it, and they let you publish it.
It's
very common.
Transparent, because I've seen and I've heard of so many people who have either had videos removed on Western social media, or they've had their account completely banned, and they're refusing to explain to them what they
very
violated.
common.
Extremely common. So that's far more transparent. You know, it's absolutely amazing too, because there's other implications to how this is backfiring. So basically, you have all of these TikTokers who, in a kind of a middle finger to their own government, who said, oh, because of course there's a difference between their stated objectives, which is, oh, we're afraid China's going to be, you know, manipulating our youth or whatever it is, and the actual economic objectives, like you were talking about.
Yeah, they don't want competition from China.
And the objectives of control. But so what these users did was they basically said to the U.S. government, all right, you're afraid that this might have Chinese connections and you're going to ban us from being able to use it? Well, we're going to go directly and download an actual Chinese app.
What's funny about this, people don't know, is that XiaoHongShu is it's kind of like Instagram, and it's more like a kind of lifestyle, fashion, culture app. It's not a political app. There are very political apps like Weibo and Bilibili where people talk, but in this case, I mean, now you have all these people posting, and they're learning about Chinese politics and society, and they never even expected that.
Yeah, it's amazing. The first day it happened, when this big rush of American users came over to XiaoHongShu, I have a friend of mine who is a doctor, fairly respected. He's the head of an oncology department in a massive hospital. He said to me, what's going on? Why are there so many foreigners on XiaoHongShu? So when I explained it, it was a deliberate way to, you know, say to the US government, you know, okay, this is what we're going to do in revenge or whatever it is. He laughed. He said, this is so amazing. I'm going to spend 2 hours a day welcoming all of these people. And it has been a really warm welcome from Chinese people to these TikTok refugees, as they're calling them. And they're having such an amazing experience interacting with Chinese. You know,
well, I just say, this is the experience I've always had. I mean, and like...
That's the actual experience on the ground when you come to China. So, yeah.
Like, so Daniel speaks Chinese much better than I do. My Chinese is, I mean, I speak some, but it's very weak. But people have always been super nice, and I've never had any issues, despite you know, me fumbling with what I'm trying to say. People have always been very friendly and helpful. Like, so what's happening digitally is exactly what my experience has been in real life.
Yeah, exactly. It's absolutely true, and an organic experience.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just on that thought, like this visceral racism and hatred in the Western media for China and other countries. I've never seen that. As an American, someone from the US, I've never had that happen to me. When I've been traveling to Venezuela, Cuba, and here, like never. Because people are always able to distinguish the U.S. government from Americans, but then in the West they don't do the opposite.
They wrap everybody up together.
So arrogant and racist.
And you imagine if finally, there is some sort of a decline of the U.S. where they then decide, you know what, we're going to take this into a more physical fight with China. Imagine how much more difficult it is going to be to. We'll continue going this way.
Yeah,
Imagine,
there's a lot of people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Imagine how much more difficult it is going to be for them to demonize their enemy and convince them that the Chinese people are people who they need to fight after this experience.
Of course.
And they approved $1.6 billion in anti-China propaganda last September. Imagine
the U.S. House of Representatives.
House of Representatives, right. And they've had other campaigns before that for whatever it was, $7 million a year. So there's a lot of money that's being pumped into shaping narratives on and shaping the opinion and perspective on what China's really about. And that has almost all entirely been undone with what has unfolded.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think now the question people are asking is, what will happen in the future? Of course, we don't know exactly, but we can make some predictions. And I want to explain something briefly for people. So earlier I talked about how China has maintained its digital sovereignty, saying that the US government uses these social media platforms as weapons. And China is, by the way, the only country in the world that has done this, because if you travel to almost every other country on earth, they use US big tech
That's
apps.
all they got, yeah.
Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, like these are the platforms. China has its own, but China also recently, what they decided is they're going to internationalize some of these platforms, like TikTok.
Okay.
So they have a mainland Chinese version, and they have the international version, right? So the mainland version of TikTok is actually Douyin, and then they have TikTok internationally. And the US is now going to start banning these international ones because they don't want competition. Well, so some people are thinking now that maybe what they'll do is that XiaoHongShu will launch an international version of the app because they have so much international interest. And then that could be the new TikTok. And there's a very real possibility that if XiaoHongShu becomes a major threat to Instagram, they're going to ban XiaoHongShu, or the international version of it, whatever it is, which will be just RedNote or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a very real possibility.
On the point of the digital sovereignty, I sometimes think about, my mother's country of Guyana. In the 60s, their first president after independence, prime minister, was a little bit too friendly with the Soviet Union, and the US decided they didn't want another Cuba situation in the region. So what they did together with the British was they went in and they fermented riots between the people of African descent and Indian descent. They literally started killing each other. My grandmother was telling me about it, how she was hiding up in her house. Nobody was leaving their homes in Georgetown. And obviously it wasn't an internet issue then, but it was a media issue. Media played a role in how they got these two groups to fight against each other. And they used it as an excuse to suspend parliament, overthrow the government, and obviously send somebody in who was a little bit more in line with the West. But that racism that stemmed from that, from those riots and from those killings, still has implications up until today. And I often think if Guyana at that time had digital sovereignty, or whatever it would be called at that point, media sovereignty, could they have prevented that from happening? Would Guyana be in a better place today than it is now? And would there be less ethnic tensions between the two groups in Guyana? Of course, it's getting better, but there's still some of it there.
You sure they're painting here?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. They're doing some more
painting.
Yeah,
the graffiti wall.
And so when you look at this and you take into context, like you said, that it is absolutely known that this is how the U.S. government is using Western platforms, you start to kind of understand China's approach.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, if the exact same thing was happening in reverse, and as much money was being spent on by a foreign government by doing the same thing to the U.S., you would see a huge crackdown on freedoms in the U.S. as well.
Well, and this is exactly what they're claiming, that the U.S. government is falsely claiming about TikTok without any evidence, and they're banning it. That's their response.
So they're validating this line of thinking already by their actions.
There's another point to raise about this. This point about Guyana is so important, and I'll raise that in a second. But the point about banning and the terminology about like all these apps, technically, Google used to operate in China.
Facebook also?
Facebook. It's not that they were banned necessarily, it's that they refused to abide by Chinese law. Yeah. Chinese law, again, on this is very specific because they emphasize social stability, and they don't want to allow the US and other foreign governments to use these platforms as a tool of destabilization to defend their sovereignty. And Google said no, they're not going to abide by Chinese law, so they left. And the same thing with Facebook.
Well, Facebook was even tied to a more specific event, which really highlighted its importance in some sort of compliance, because that was when there were terrorist attacks in Xinjiang. Yeah. And they found out that they were organizing in Facebook groups and things like that. And the government reached out to them and said, listen, people are dying. We've got terrorists using your network to do this. We need you to kind of put a cap on this to find a way to control it. And they said, no. That's not what we do. That's not the way we work.
And meanwhile, so, that is what they do with the Israeli regime.
Well, yeah, exactly.
When Israel says ban these Palestinian poets because they publish poetry defending Palestinian resistance.
There you go.
They're not even organizing anything. They're just the ban, and then Israel kills them. Like, Israel uses that information. I mean, so of course there's this blatant double standard.
Yeah, no, exactly.
But why is that? Why is there a double standard? Because again, what you mentioned in the case with Guyana, like, because the U.S. uses these platforms as tools of destabilization. And we've seen this again and again and again, targeting many different countries. And this goes back decades. This is what the CIA's specialty is. In fact, when the CIA was founded, its first operation ever was in 1948, and it was to rig the Italian election against the Communist Party. That was the first thing the CIA ever did. Yeah. And how do they do that? They spread propaganda and fake news in the media. They bought off right-wing politicians. They bribed the Catholic Church. So how can you have, in the 21st century, how can you be able to defend your sovereignty as a state, as a society, when you have these big platforms that the U.S. is using to destabilize and meddle everywhere? We see this now with Elon Musk. He's meddling in many different countries. Yeah. I mean, so now what we see is that people are coming around to realize that the Chinese perspective was actually a very reasonable perspective. And now the U.S. government is basically doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll start heading back in this direction. But I think a way to wrap this up, obviously, is what happens next. And you covered that a little bit. Obviously, XiaoHongShu may just be banned also if it becomes popular enough. Maybe it's China that fumbles the bag on this one. With this influx of people and they don't know how to deal with it, or the platform makes some mistakes that just turns everybody off from it. Who knows? Maybe the people who are coming over lose interest in it. I mean, there's so many different things that can happen, but at least in the meantime, it has become such an educational experience for so many people to learn about China. And I think it started something that is irreversible, no matter what happens with this specific platform per se.
I agree. I think this definitely, it could be part of something. Wow, actually, this is really beautiful. You should show this as well.
Let's see here.
There are people here taking a lot of photos, and it's like they have murals.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, continue. We can still hear through the microphone, so go ahead. Yeah.
So I think this could very well be like a kind of transformative moment, because what a lot of people don't realize in the West is that there is a big debate in China about these kinds of issues among academics, intellectuals, and they have been having a debate recently about their social media moderation policy. So this could be a way of helping to maybe more internationalize social media platforms that China has. And maybe, again, they do that through creating a XiaoHongShu international version like TikTok. But what I also think this is going to show is that TikTok is not the end, it's the beginning. This is the end of the beginning, if you will, but it's not the beginning of the end.
Right.
So I think that what we've seen in the past few years is that the US had a monopoly on social media platforms, that the vast majority of the major apps downloaded around the world were from US big tech monopolies based in Silicon Valley. And China has been able to break that and create these internationally used platforms. And the US doesn't want any competition. It wants a monopoly because that's one of the main sources of its power. The monopoly it has in the dollar system and the financial system, the monopoly it has in the military-industrial complex, forcing countries in NATO to buy US weapons, and the monopoly it has through technology, and forcing other countries to only use US technology, forcing European so-called allies to remove Huawei 5G technology. So now that TikTok could be banned, there will be other apps that pop up that will become popular, and then we'll probably see the US government ban them as well.
Yeah, obviously we could also see a potential capitulation where the US government realizes how this is blowing up in its face and they roll back you don't think
Except
so?
They never do that.
Well,
they always double down.
I did hear something about Trump talking about some sort of an executive order to undo this ban. So
this is actually interesting. It's an example of how like the fights within the oligarchy, the internal conflicts can sometimes have these positive benefits, because so Zuckerberg and Trump had been fighting for a long time. Now Zuckerberg's trying to rebrand himself, and He's trying to copy Elon Musk and all this. But previously, Trump said that my enemy is Facebook. And he created his whole Truth Social thing.
Yep.
And what the irony is that when Trump was president the first time, he was the one who tried to ban TikTok.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
when Biden became president, Biden actually succeeded in banning TikTok. So Trump's now, for two reasons, because he wants to portray himself as the alternative to the Democrats. He's saying, I'm going to save TikTok. And because he hates Facebook and he blames Facebook for losing the 2020 election. So this could be good for TikTokers, obviously.
Yeah.
So we're in this very strange moment in U.S.
Sometimes
politics.
these internal squabbles undermine the movement of the empire.
Yeah, definitely.
No, it'll be interesting. I mean, all of this stuff, the control that is so essential. I mean, it was the same thing that was driving the Huawei 5G network bans also, talking about the potential backdoors, despite the fact that the UK and top intelligence agencies examined Huawei gear and didn't find any sort of vulnerabilities. And the truth was because the existing 5G infrastructure throughout the world was controlled by Western governments. You had, I think it was through Switzerland, Crypto AG, a company that basically had these backdoors for the CIA. Yep. You have confirmed instances of the U.S. government spying on the European Union, while the European Union is totally ignoring that, but then talking about the potential of being spied on by China. The world is completely backwards, but I think a lot of people are waking up now, and they're ironically coming to Chinese social media to have unfiltered view. It reminds me of an irony before where there was I think it was an Iranian politician arguing with an American politician on Twitter before Elon Musk had taken it over in regards to the assassination of Soleimani. And they ended up banning the Iranian the politician. And what ended up happening...
Well, I do want to hear, just a quick note.
Yeah.
This was a policy, when Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general, the US government told social media platforms to ban people that were saying anything positive or sympathetic about Qasem Soleimani.
That's correct. Instagram actually came out with a statement saying, in order to comply with US sanctions, we are banning anybody who is sympathetic towards the Iranian regime. And so, I mean, that's right there.
This was the major general of a country.
Yeah. And you had people who were just simply adding context, saying, but by the way, he was in
He
Iraq
defeated ISIS.
Well, he defeated ISIS, and also he was on his way to have peace talks with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And anybody who was adding this context, so many of them got banned. But anyways, in this specific instance of the Iranian politician, he ended up having to continue his argument with the American politician on Chinese social media, on Weibo. Weibo suddenly became the most free place for them to have this discussion. So what is going on now kind of reminds me of that irony, but it'll interesting to see how it plays out. I think we covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything else you want to end on before we go for lunch?
No, I just think, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Daniel. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for showing me around Chongqing. It's nice to be in these areas that are not as well known. There aren't really any tourists here. But yeah, I think this is a good introduction for people who are trying to just find out what's happening with the US and China and the whole new Cold War. I think this episode is really illustrative because there's so much propaganda, disinformation about China. Mm-hmm. And when you actually look beneath the surface and you start doing some basic research, you can see that really a lot of the Western media simply lies. I mean, like it's really, it sounds simplistic, it sounds like we're exaggerating, but when you actually get to spend time in some of these countries, you realize it's just completely false. Yeah. And then you start realizing that actually, not only is what they're saying about China false, but what they're also saying about the U.S. Oh, yeah, the good things they claim about the U.S. are also false. Right. So, look, China is a country that has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. They haven't been involved in a war since 1979. They want to create a more peaceful, multipolar world in which the global South has equal representation, and that's seen as a threat. Yeah, so, sure. I mean, so if people are interested in these kinds of topics, they should just keep following our work. And what I hope is that this issue with XiaoHongShu and TikTok can be kind of an eye-opening moment that will get more people interested in following geopolitics, because it's very important. It affects everyone. Both for following people like you who deep dive into this stuff, and also to come and visit for yourself. You know, people who, I think that this is inevitably going to spark a lot of people coming over and actually coming and seeing everything for themselves, to really put the nail in the coffin
and realize that it is completely in conflict with what they're being told overseas. But no, I think,
And it's become very easy, especially for a lot of for people from Europe and Southeast Asia. And there are now, I think, like 50 countries that can people who have passports from those countries can come to mainland China without a visa.
Yeah, exactly.
And even people who need a visa, it's not that hard to get one.
It's not, yeah. All right, well, that was an amazing chat. We will continue on and have lunch, but thanks for that, and thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Daniel.